So I thought this was a really interesting tweet and it ties in with Agile. It says, healthy workflows adapt to the needs of the team, and occasional pain is normal, and chronic pain is not. So that occasional pain is changing your practice pattern, your outlook, how you see things, or how you change your review of the process. But you shouldn't be constantly doing those things and changing something that you've already changed. So change and then change and then change. It's just getting to a standard that you can recognize and adopt. Now, I realize this is after lunch, so, but here's a quiz or a pop question. So if anybody knows what this represents, can you raise your hand? Okay, we got one. I see one. Two, okay, good. Three, great. So it's called a Mobius Loop, or Mobius, has a couple other names, but it's Mobius Loop. And what it is a continuous circle. So if you, let's see, if you start at one side of the circle, if you start at the top, and you go all the way around the outside of that circle, you come back to the forefront, you go on the outside, you come on the inside, and back, and you've completed the circle without ever passing over an edge. So it's called a Mobius Loop. And the reason I bring this up is it sort of represents a different view of how that Agile cycle works, starting with one point, coming through to fruition, and then now you're looking at the next object to move forward and continue to refine your processes. So speaking of processes, the nursing process, we're all pretty familiar with, from the assessment, the evaluation, the diagnosis, planning, implementation, evaluation, and maintenance. But what some people don't realize is that the software development lifecycle has a very similar structure. So you have the planning, analysis, design, implementation, the testing and integration, and the maintenance. Now, in both cases, the maintenance could be changes, revisions, or reassessment of something before you go back through that cycle. So again, we have a very circular cycle, constantly in flux, going through the process many, many times, just as you do with the nursing process. So we do also have, to kind of give you a little bit of background before we get into the more details, we want to make sure there are several different software development life cycles, or software development models. The Waterfall, the V model, Iterative, Spiral, Big Bang, Agile. I'll go into a little bit more detail on each one of these. So in the Waterfall, it's a very sequential design process. It has its own advantages and disadvantages. It is a very rigid model. It goes from point A to Z, all the way from a stepwise process. It's a very comprehensive documentation. It requires a lot of comprehensive documentation to make sure all of your components are defined before you begin the process. To revisit a change, you have to go back to the very beginning. So it is very linear in that way. The V model is a little bit of a variation. It's a validation and verification. But you do have to have a longer delivery cycle because you have to know all of the points of validation and verification as you move through. And if you run into a hiccup, you have to, again, start over. So it is a modification of the waterfall, but it does require a lot more stringency around that validation at each phase. The iterative cycle is a cycle, that design process in which every step is repeated after each cycle or phase of the software development life cycle. And each cycle produces its own complete product. It has strong risk management possibilities, and it's quick to achieve a working model. One of those examples could be how Microsoft Word was deployed over the years. Initially, it was a text documentation, then it added spell check, and added several other features and templates. So each one of those is an iteration as it went through the iterative processes, it improved on the different functionality that was available. Now, the disadvantage is it could take a lot more time to get a working product, and it does consume a lot of resources. It's very intensive. The spiral model is an offshoot of that iterative model. Think of it as a spring. You're going through, as a spring goes through, and you're going through each of those phases in, let's say the spring's in a column, you're going through the different phases, and it's used for a highly customized product. User feedback is incorporated very early. The disadvantage is it could lead to an endless project. And if your customer doesn't know what they want or what the endpoint is, it could take a lot of time and a lot of resources. Now, Big Bang, I'm sure people have heard of Big Bang. We're going to go Big Bang with our rollout of whichever software that you're using. In a development lifecycle process, it has limited processes in place. It's effective for smaller projects. So in the software development lifecycle, it's not the same as going Big Bang with an EHR implementation. It's more about putting in the process. It could apply, I guess, but it does have its risks. The disadvantages are that there's minimal time spent in planning, and it could be, requirements may not be as solid at the outset, and for large projects, it has a lot of risk. Because if you don't have it defined and then you go live, you could have a lot of failure. Now, Agile, the one we've been talking about or we're looking to talk about, it is a very iterative design process, emphasizing the interaction with the customer, which is very important. Constantly getting the feedback, constantly testing the process, and going through smaller iterations to get validation. So it takes a little bit of each of those other concepts and puts them into one whole concept. It does provide a deliverable very quickly, and then with each iteration, you're doing your own testing of that process. Again, if the customer is not clear on what the direction is, though, that could lead to some rework and some delays. Now here we have showing the waterfall, which looks like a staircase, and that, again, if you start at the top and you go through each cycle and you end up at the bottom and you have to make changes, you have to go back to the top and start your process over again. With Agile, you take each concept, each smaller concept, and you go through all of those stages of the development lifecycle to get it completed, and then you continue to refine it with each step based on feedback from your peers, feedback from your customer, feedback from the successes or failures of that process. So it takes the waterfall and puts it a little bit more dynamic. So here is a very more detailed definition. It continually tests the workflow of the software or the development or the workflow. It's structured an iterative approach to project management and product development. It recognizes that the volatility of the product development and provides a methodology for self-organizing teams to respond to the change without going off the rails. So as your work groups are looking at something and you start identifying a deviation, it's easier to come back to the group and say, okay, let's look at this again and start moving, reevaluating, and then moving into the other direction that you needed to do. So you can do that through those iterative processes more quickly and thereby not have a large deviation at the end of the project. One of the key concepts is, well, it was a quote, but it was, no one has the luxury to develop a product for years or months in a black box. And that's kind of how some of the original software, even the Microsoft and WordPerfect and all of that were developed. But now we become more dynamic, more customer feedback with forums and chats and things like that. So that we're getting a lot more input on our products. And it applies to healthcare as well, and we'll cover those in just a minute. So Waterfall 2.0 might be another definition for Agile. Experts suggest that Agile was specifically designed to overcome those issues that Waterfall has, and Agile development methodology incorporates the same steps, but applies them in very small or smaller bite-sized chunks to make them more manageable and be able to respond more quickly.